Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. I'm Mark. I've been lurking here for a while, but never thought I'd be the one posting. Well, life has a funny way of throwing you into situations you'd never imagine. I'm here because I need to get this off my chest and maybe hear from people who've been through something similar. I'm 49, married to my wife Connie, for 25 years. We have 2 kids, Megan, 23, and Ryan, 20. I thought we had a solid life together, family trips, a home we built from scratch, and a love story that felt like it could stand the test of time. Boy, was I wrong. It started small, the way these things usually do. Connie had been acting differently. Nothing huge, just little things. She'd be on her phone more, laughing at texts I wasn't privy to. She started dressing up a little more than usual for work events and girls' nights. I wanted to believe it was all innocent. But then last month, I came home early from work to surprise her with a lunch date. I walked in to find her on the phone, whispering and giggling like a teenager. She didn't hear me come in, and as I stood there frozen, I caught her saying, "I can't wait to see you again." I confronted her right there and then. I'll never forget the look on her face, part shock, part annoyance. Like I'd inconvenienced her by finding out. She denied it at first, of course. She claimed I was overreacting, that it was just a friend from work. But when I asked her to show me her phone, she refused. That's when I knew. My Connie, the woman I'd spent over 2 decades building a life with, was lying to me. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, we had a blowout fight. She admitted she'd been texting another man but swore it was nothing physical, just emotional. "It's just someone who listens to me," she said. "You're always busy, Mark." That hit hard. I've been working overtime to provide for our family, thinking I was doing the right thing. But apparently, that wasn't enough. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the living room replaying every moment of our marriage in my head, wondering when it all started to go wrong. The next day, I called in sick and went through our phone bill. It didn't take long to find his number, showing up in hundreds of texts and late-night calls. His name was Alan, a guy from her office, divorced, no kids. I confronted her again with the evidence. That's when the floodgates opened. She admitted it had been going on for months, that they'd met up a few times, but insisted it wasn't serious. "It was a mistake," she said. "I still love you, Mark. I want to fix this." Fix this? I didn't even know where to start. I was too numb, too angry to respond. All I could think about was how she'd betrayed not just me but our entire family. And the worst part? Our daughter Megan overheard the argument. The next morning, she asked me, "Is it true? Did Mom cheat on you?" That's where I'll stop for now. There's so much more to this story, how it's impacted our family, my decision to leave, and the mess that followed. But this is already getting long. Thanks for reading if you've made it this far. I'll share more soon. I just need to know, how do you even begin to pick up the pieces after something like this? After Megan asked me if her mom had cheated, I didn't know what to say. I froze. How do you tell your daughter that the person she's looked up to her entire life made a choice that could shatter our family? I told her the truth, at least, the parts one could manage to say. "Yes, your mom made a mistake, and we're trying to figure out what happens next." Megan didn't say much after that. She just nodded, but I could see her brain working overtime. She'd always been a quiet kid, more of an observer than Ryan, who's fiery and outspoken. But I could tell this was eating her up inside. Later that day, Connie pulled her aside to talk. I overheard part of their conversation. Megan was crying, saying things like, "How could you do this to Dad? And you lied to all of us." It broke my heart because it wasn't just my marriage that was unraveling, it was the relationship between Connie and our kids too. Ryan found out later that week. Megan must have told him because I certainly hadn't. He came storming into the house, shouting, "What's wrong with you?" at Connie. He was livid, pacing the living room while Connie sat there, trying to explain herself. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she kept saying, as if that made it better. Ryan wasn't having it. "You threw away everything for some random guy at work? What's wrong with you?" Then he turned to me and said, "Are you really staying here with her after this?" That question hit me hard. At that point, I hadn't decided what to do. I was still in shock, trying to wrap my head around everything. But Ryan's words stuck with me. The idea of staying with Connie after what she'd done, it felt like a betrayal to myself. I left the house that night. I told Connie I needed space to think, and I packed a bag and drove to my dad's place. He's in his 70s, widowed for over a decade, and not much of a talker. But when I showed up at his door with my suitcase and a face full of emotions, he just nodded, stepped aside, and let me in. We didn't talk much that first night. He just handed me a beer, turned on the game, and sat with me in silence. It was exactly what I needed. The next morning, Connie called me. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail saying she wanted to talk, that she was sorry, that she'd do anything to fix this. But at that moment, I didn't want to hear it. I couldn't. I didn't even listen to the whole message. Over the next few days, I started to settle into life at my dad's. It was strange, being back in my childhood home, sleeping in the same bed I had as a teenager. It felt like stepping into a time machine, except this time, I was broken in a way I'd never been before. I spent hours replaying the last few months in my head, wondering how I'd missed the signs, questioning every moment Connie and I had shared. Megan and Ryan called me a lot during those first few days. Megan just wanted to check in, make sure I was okay. Ryan, on the other hand, was angry, at Connie, at me, at the whole situation. He kept saying things like, "You can't just let her get away with this, Dad. You've got to do something." But what could I do? I couldn't go back in time and stop it from happening. All I could do was try to figure out how to move forward. That's where I'll leave it for now. The next part's where things really start to get messy. Thanks for reading, and if you have any advice on dealing with this kind of betrayal, I'm all ears. I'm still trying to figure out if there's a way to salvage any part of my family, or if I even want to. Living at my dad's house was surreal. I'd gone from being a husband and father in what I thought was a stable family to being a grown man crashing in his childhood bedroom. The posters on the wall were long gone, but the memories of that space, staying up late listening to music, dreaming of the life I'd eventually build, were still there. Funny how life never turns out the way you picture it. Connie kept trying to contact me. She texted, called, even emailed. I ignored most of it, but one night, curiosity got the best of me, and I opened one of her emails. It was long and full of apologies, excuses, and promises. She said things like, "I never stopped loving you," and "Alan didn't mean anything. It was just a stupid mistake." She begged me to come home so we could work through this together. I couldn't even finish reading it. Every word felt hollow. If I was still the man she loved, how could she have betrayed me like that? I didn't respond, and I didn't go home. A few days later, I got a call from Megan. She sounded upset, almost panicked. "Dad, you need to come over. Mom's losing it." My first thought was that something had happened to Connie, that she was hurt or worse. But when I got to the house, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by half-empty wine bottles and a pile of tissues. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She started crying the moment she saw me. "Mark, please. I can't do this without you. I'll do anything. Just come home." Megan stood in the corner, arms crossed, looking like she wanted to disappear. Ryan wasn't there, smart kid. I sat down across from Connie, and for the first time since everything came out, I really looked at her. She wasn't the confident, put-together woman I'd married. She was a mess, broken in a way I didn't recognize. Part of me felt sorry for her. Another part of me was angry that she was falling apart now, after she'd already destroyed so much. "What do you want me to say, Connie?" I finally asked. "You made your choice when you decided to go behind my back. You didn't think about me or the kids then, so why should I believe you're thinking about us now?" She cried harder, mumbling something about how she'd made a mistake, how she thought I didn't care about her anymore, how she was lonely. That word, lonely, hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd worked my butt off for our family, put in long hours so we could have the life we always talked about. And somehow, that made her lonely? It felt like a slap in the face. Megan interrupted before I could say anything else. "Mom, stop. You're not helping." She turned to me, her voice shaking. "Dad, I'm not taking sides, but you can't just leave us like this. Ryan's already checked out, and I'm stuck trying to keep everything together." Her words cut deep. She wasn't wrong. In trying to protect myself, I'd left my kids to deal with the fallout. I'd thought about what Connie's affair had done to me, but I hadn't really considered what it had done to them. And that made me feel like a failure all over again. I told Megan I'd think about what to do and left without saying much else. On the drive back to my dad's, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. Connie's tears, Megan's frustration, the weight of it all, it felt like I was drowning. How do you even begin to fix something that broken? That night, I sat in my dad's kitchen, staring at my phone. I thought about calling Connie, about telling her we could try counseling or something. But then I remembered her laughing on the phone with Alan, remembered the way she lied to my face when I asked her what was going on. Instead, I opened a blank document on my laptop and started writing. I didn't have a plan or a goal, I just needed to get everything out of my head. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal, it all poured out onto the screen. I wrote until my eyes burned and my hands ached. When I finally stopped, I felt a little lighter, like I'd let go of some of the weight I'd been carrying. I didn't know it at the time, but that night would be the beginning of something new for me. Writing became my escape, my way of processing everything that had happened. But I'll get to that later. For now, I'll just say this. When your whole life falls apart, sometimes the only thing you can do is start picking up the pieces, one at a time. After the scene with Connie and Megan, things started to unravel even more. Ryan showed up at my dad's house a few days later, unannounced. I opened the door, and he brushed past me, his face flushed with anger. "You can't just leave us with her," he snapped, dropping his backpack onto the floor. I didn't even get a chance to greet him before he launched into it. "She's losing it, Dad. She cries all the time, and Megan's the one picking up the pieces. I can't stay there. I can't even look at her." Ryan's always been the emotional one, quick to anger but also fiercely protective. I could see how much this was tearing him up, and it killed me that he felt stuck in the middle of it all. "I know it's hard," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I needed to step away for a bit. I needed time to think." He scoffed. "What's there to think about? She cheated on you. She ruined everything. Why are you even considering giving her a second chance?" That hit me hard. The truth was, I didn't know what I was considering. Part of me wanted to believe we could fix things, for the kids' sake if nothing else. But another part of me knew that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. "Ryan," I said, "this isn't as simple as just walking away or staying. It's complicated. Your mom and I have been together for 25 years. That's not something you just throw away overnight." He shook his head, frustrated. "It's not complicated. She made it simple when she decided to cheat. You're making it complicated." That conversation stuck with me long after Ryan stormed off to my old bedroom to cool down. He wasn't wrong. Connie's decision to cheat had been simple, selfish, and devastating. And yet here I was, tied in knots, trying to figure out how to move forward. Megan, on the other hand, was handling things differently. She called me that night, her voice tired but calm. "Dad," she said, "I don't think Mom's okay." "What do you mean?" I asked. "She barely eats. She's either crying or just sitting there, staring at nothing. I'm worried about her." Hearing that didn't give me the satisfaction I thought it might. Instead, it filled me with guilt. As much as I was hurt and angry, Connie was still the mother of my kids, and knowing she was falling apart made me feel like I'd failed to protect her too. Megan continued, "Ryan's been avoiding her. He only comes home to sleep, and when he's there, he's slamming doors and picking fights. I'm trying to hold it together, but it feels like everything's falling apart." "I'm sorry, Megan," I said. "I didn't mean for you to take on all this." "It's not your fault," she replied. "But I can't do this by myself. I need you to come back." That was the hardest thing to hear. I didn't want to go back, not yet. The thought of being in that house, facing Connie, pretending everything was okay, it was too much. But how could I leave Megan to shoulder it all on her own? "I'll think about it," I told her, which felt like a cop-out even as I said it. The truth was, I was scared. Scared of what I'd find if I went back. Scared of what it would mean for me, for Connie, for the kids. Scared that no matter what I did, it wouldn't be enough to fix the damage that had been done. That night, I went back to writing. I didn't know why it helped, but it did. Every word I typed felt like a step toward clarity, even if it was just a tiny one. I wrote about the betrayal, the anger, the guilt. I wrote about Ryan's outbursts and Megan's quiet strength. I wrote about Connie, about the woman I thought I knew and the stranger she'd become. And somewhere in all that writing, I started to realize something. This wasn't just about Connie's affair. It was about me, About who I was and who I wanted to be in the aftermath of all this. It wasn't a revelation exactly, but it was a start. I'll stop here for now. The next part gets even messier, but I'll save that for later. Thanks for reading, and if you have any advice on dealing with angry kids or figuring out your next steps after a betrayal like this, I'd love to hear it. I'm still trying to find my way through this mess. About a week after Ryan's visit, Connie texted me again. This time, it wasn't another plea for forgiveness or an apology. It was a simple message. Can we talk? Just us. Please. I debated ignoring it, but Megan's words, "I need you to come back," kept playing in my head. As much as I didn't want to see Connie, I knew we had to have a real conversation. We couldn't keep dancing around this mess, especially with the kids caught in the middle. I agreed to meet her at the house, but only if the kids weren't there. She said Megan and Ryan would be out, so I reluctantly went. Walking back into that house felt like stepping into a war zone. The walls were the same, the furniture was in its usual place, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Connie was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. She looked tired, older, almost. Her makeup-free face was pale, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. It was a far cry from the polished, confident woman I'd spent most of my life with. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice soft, almost timid. "I'm here for the kids," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She nodded and took a deep breath. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed everything we built. But I need you to understand why." I cut her off. "I don't want excuses, Connie. I don't want to hear about how you were lonely or how I wasn't around enough. We've been married for 25 years. If you had a problem, you could have come to me. Instead, you went to him." She winced, but I wasn't going to sugarcoat it. She needed to face the reality of what she'd done. "You're right," she said after a long pause. "I should have come to you. But I didn't because I was scared you wouldn't care." That caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of a napkin. "We stopped talking, Mark. I tried to tell you how I was feeling, but you were always so busy, working, fixing things around the house, taking care of everyone but me. I started to feel invisible. And then Alan, he noticed me. He made me feel important." Her voice cracked on that last word, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. I wanted to feel angry, to lash out, but all I felt was this deep, aching sadness. Somewhere along the line, we'd lost each other, and neither of us had noticed until it was too late. "I'm not saying that to justify what I did," she continued, her voice trembling. "I know it was wrong. I know I betrayed you and the kids. I don't know how to fix this." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell her she'd made her bed and now she had to lie in it. But another part of me, probably the part that still loved her, wanted to believe we could find a way forward. "What about Alan?" I asked finally. "Are you still in contact with him?" She shook her head vehemently. "No. I ended it the day you found out. I haven't spoken to him since. Why should I believe you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for her phone and slid it across the table toward me. "Check it," she said. "Look at the messages, the call log. I've got nothing to hide." I hesitated. I didn't want to be the kind of person who snooped through someone else's phone, even if that person had betrayed me. But in that moment, I needed proof. I picked up the phone and scrolled through her messages. Sure enough, there were no texts or calls to Alan. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it was something. A small step toward trust, maybe. We talked for hours that night. It wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't pleasant, but it felt necessary. Connie admitted to everything, how the affair started, how it escalated, and how guilty she'd felt the entire time. She cried more times than I could count, and by the end of it, we were both emotionally drained. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said as I got up to leave. "But I want you to know I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. I just nodded and walked out the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words kept running through my head. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I wanted to believe her, but I didn't know if I could. Trust is a fragile thing, and once it's broken, it's almost impossible to put back together. I turned to writing again, pouring my thoughts onto the screen. This time, though, I wasn't just writing about the pain. I started writing about the possibility of healing, not for Connie, but for myself. I didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. More to come soon. Thanks for sticking with me, everyone. Writing this out has been more helpful than I expected. If anyone has advice on whether reconciliation is even possible after something like this, I'd love to hear it. Right now, I'm just taking things one day at a time. After that long talk with Connie, I kept my distance for a while. I didn't move back home, and I still wasn't sure what my next step would be. But life doesn't pause for you to figure things out, especially when there are kids involved. The divide between Ryan and Megan became more obvious as time went on. Ryan was firmly in my corner, refusing to even acknowledge Connie when he was at the house. Megan, on the other hand, seemed torn. She didn't defend her mom's actions, but she wasn't as quick to shut her out either. It felt like she was stuck trying to play referee between everyone, and I hated that she had to take on that role. One day, Ryan called me, his voice tight with frustration. "Dad, I can't do this anymore. Living there, it's too much. Why don't you stay here for a while?" I offered, though I knew my dad's house wasn't exactly ideal for a 20-year-old. "I'm thinking about moving out," he said. "Getting my own place. I've got some money saved up, and I can pick up more hours at work." I understood where he was coming from, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was running away from the problem. "Ryan, you don't have to do this alone. We'll figure it out together." "I don't want to figure it out," he snapped. "I just want to get away from her." Megan, on the other hand, was more open to talking. She called me one night, and we ended up having a long conversation about everything. "Mom's trying, Dad," she said. "She's been going to therapy, and she's even looking into couples counseling. I think she really wants to fix things." "That's great, Megan," I said. "But I'm not sure if that's enough. Some things, they're not so easy to fix." "I get that," she replied. "But she's still Mom. I can't just hate her forever." Her words stuck with me. Megan wasn't excusing Connie's actions, but she was willing to see her as more than just the sum of her mistakes. It made me wonder if I was capable of the same thing, or if I even wanted to be. A week later, Megan asked if we could all sit down together as a family. "Just to talk," she said. "No yelling, no accusations. We need to figure out how to move forward." I was hesitant, but I agreed. If nothing else, I owed it to my kids to try. The meeting didn't go as smoothly as Megan had hoped. Ryan refused to sit next to Connie and spent most of the time glaring at her. Connie tried to explain herself, but Ryan interrupted her more than once, calling her out for her choices. "You destroyed this family," he said at one point, his voice trembling with anger. "And now you want us to just act like everything's fine?" "No," Connie said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect that. I just want a chance to make things better." Ryan wasn't having it. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Megan looked defeated, and Connie was a mess. I sat there, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to chase after Ryan, but I also knew he needed space. Megan turned to me. "See what I mean? We're falling apart, Dad." "I know," I said quietly. "But it's going to take time." After the meeting, I decided to have individual conversations with both kids. I told Ryan that his anger was valid, but he couldn't let it consume him. I told Megan that she didn't have to fix everything herself, that it wasn't her responsibility to hold the family together. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what I did, someone would end up hurt. I just hoped that, with time, we could find some way to heal, together or apart. More to come soon. Writing this out has been a lifeline, so thank you for reading. If anyone has advice on handling kids in situations like this, I'd really appreciate it. Right now, I'm just trying to figure out how to be the dad they need while also dealing with my own heartbreak. After the failed family meeting, I was emotionally drained. Watching Ryan lash out, Megan struggle to mediate, and Connie crumble under the weight of her own choices, it was too much. But the silver lining was that it forced me to confront one undeniable fact: we couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. A few days later, Connie texted me again. This time, it wasn't a plea for reconciliation or another apology. It was a practical suggestion. Would you be open to attending therapy? Just for co-parenting. We need to learn how to be there for Megan and Ryan. I'll admit, I was skeptical. Therapy felt like a band-aid for a wound that was too deep to heal. But the kids were my priority, and if therapy could help us navigate this mess for their sake, I was willing to try. Our first session was awkward, to say the least. We sat in the counselor's office, barely making eye contact. Connie looked nervous, fidgeting with her hands, while I kept my arms crossed, guarding myself. The therapist, a calm and collected woman named Dr. Patel, started by asking us what we hoped to achieve. "I just want to figure out how to support our kids," I said. "They're caught in the middle of this, and it's not fair to them." Connie nodded. "Same here. I don't want them to feel like they have to pick sides. And I want to rebuild trust, if that's even possible." I stayed quiet. I wasn't ready to discuss trust, not yet. Dr. Patel guided the conversation toward the kids, and it was the first time Connie and I had really talked about them without tension. We agreed that Ryan needed space and that Megan was under too much pressure. Connie suggested we start alternating one-on-one time with them, so they didn't feel like they had to deal with both of us at once. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. The next week, I took Megan out for dinner. She seemed relieved to have a break from the chaos at home. Over burgers and fries, we talked about everything except the affair, her classes, her friends, even the TV shows she'd been binge-watching. For the first time in weeks, she laughed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. With Ryan, it was trickier. I took him out to a baseball game, hoping the distraction would help. He barely said a word during the drive there, and I could tell he was still stewing. Finally, during the 7th inning, he broke the silence. "Do you think you'll ever forgive her?" he asked, not looking at me. The question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "It's complicated." Ryan snorted. "That's what everyone keeps saying. It's complicated." "It's not complicated, Dad. She cheated. She lied. End of story." I sighed, searching for the right words. "You're right, Ryan. What she did was wrong. But forgiveness isn't about saying it's okay. It's about finding a way to move forward, for your own peace of mind." He didn't respond, but I could tell he was thinking about it. That was enough for now. As the weeks went on, things started to shift, slowly but noticeably. Ryan spent more time with me at my dad's house, and Megan seemed less overwhelmed. Connie and I kept going to therapy, and while we still had a long way to go, we were learning how to communicate without everything devolving into a fight. Meanwhile, my writing became an unexpected outlet. What started as a way to vent my feelings began to evolve into something more structured. I wasn't just journaling anymore, I was crafting a story. It wasn't about my life exactly, but it drew heavily from my experiences. Writing about betrayal, loss, and the slow road to self-discovery helped me process my emotions in a way I hadn't expected. One night, Megan found me typing away on my laptop. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Just a little project," I said, downplaying it. She peered over my shoulder and read a few lines. "This is really good, Dad. You should publish it." I laughed. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But her encouragement meant more than I could say. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, not just for me, but for my kids. I don't know where this journey will lead, but for now, I'm taking it one day at a time. Thanks for reading, and if you've got any advice on balancing personal healing with family responsibilities, I'd love to hear it. It's a long road ahead, but I'm starting to believe it's one I can walk. As the weeks turned into months, the sharp edges of the situation began to soften, just a little. Therapy was helping, both for me and Connie as co-parents and for Ryan and Megan individually. It wasn't some magical fix, but it gave us tools to communicate without tearing each other apart. Ryan had finally settled on moving out. He found a small apartment with a buddy from work and was excited about having his own space. I was proud of him for taking control of his life, but I couldn't ignore the underlying reason: he wanted distance from Connie. He hadn't said it outright, but I could see it in his eyes every time her name came up. Before he moved out, I decided to have one last heart-to-heart with him. We were in my dad's backyard, grilling burgers and watching the sunset. "Ryan, I know this has been hard on you," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I just want you to know it's okay to feel however you feel. But don't let it eat away at you. Holding on to anger, it doesn't hurt anyone but yourself." He stared at the ground for a long time before replying. "I'm trying, Dad. I don't know how to let it go. Every time I think about what she did to you, to us, I get so angry." "I get it," I said. "But you're stronger than that anger. You don't have to forgive her right now, or ever. But you do have to find a way to live your life without it controlling you. He nodded, but I could tell it would take time for those words to really sink in. Megan, meanwhile, was making strides in her own way. She started coming to me for advice more often, and we were rebuilding a closeness that I hadn't realized we'd lost over the years. One night, she asked if we could go through some old family photo albums together. At first, I wasn't sure if I was ready. Those albums were full of memories that felt tainted now, holidays, birthdays, moments that had once been perfect but now felt like lies. But I said yes, and I'm glad I did. We spent hours flipping through the pages, laughing at my terrible fashion choices in the 90s and reminiscing about trips to the beach. For a little while, it felt like the old days. Then we came across a photo of Connie holding Megan as a baby, her face lit up with pure joy. Megan stared at it for a long time before saying, "I want to believe she's still that person." "She is," I said quietly. "She made a terrible mistake, but that doesn't erase the good parts of her." Megan looked at me, her eyes filled with hope. "Do you think we'll ever be a family again?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." The next big milestone came when Connie asked if I would be willing to join her and the kids for a family dinner. "No pressure," she said. "I just think it would mean a lot to them." It took me a few days to decide. The idea of sitting across the table from her, pretending everything was fine, felt impossible. But Megan and Ryan deserved to have at least one normal moment in the middle of all this chaos. So I agreed. The dinner was awkward at first. Ryan barely spoke, and Megan tried too hard to keep the conversation flowing. Connie looked like she was walking on eggshells, terrified of saying the wrong thing. But as the evening went on, something shifted. We started reminiscing about funny family moments, like the time I got stuck on the roof trying to hang Christmas lights or when Ryan accidentally locked himself in the bathroom for 3 hours. For a brief moment, we felt like a family again. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. After dinner, as I was leaving, Connie walked me to the door. "Thank you for doing this," she said. "I know it wasn't easy." "It wasn't," I admitted. "But the kids needed it." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I miss this. I miss us." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. Instead, I gave her a small nod and walked out the door. That night, I sat down at my laptop and wrote until the early hours of the morning. The story I'd been working on was taking shape, and for the first time, I felt like I had something worth sharing. Writing was becoming more than just therapy. It was a way to create something meaningful out of the wreckage of my life. There's still a long road ahead, and I don't know what the future holds for me or my family. But that dinner gave me a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's still light to be found. More to come soon. If anyone has advice on navigating these baby steps toward healing, I'm all ears. For now, I'm just grateful for the little moments of peace we've been able to find. The dinner had given me a small glimpse of what normal might look like again, but it also left me feeling unsettled. Connie's words at the door, "I miss us," kept replaying in my mind. She seemed genuine, but I couldn't shake the thought that those words came too late. After 25 years of marriage, it took an affair and the near destruction of our family for her to say something like that. A few days later, Megan asked if I'd talk to Connie again. "Not for you two," she clarified quickly, "but for us. Ryan and I need to know what's happening. Are you staying separated? Are you getting divorced? We're just stuck in limbo." She was right. I hadn't made any concrete decisions. I'd been drifting, trying to deal with the day-to-day without looking too far ahead. But Megan's plea forced me to confront the reality I'd been avoiding. I texted Connie, asking if we could meet for coffee. She agreed immediately, and we set a time for the following afternoon. When I walked into the cafe, Connie was already there, nervously stirring a cup of tea. She looked up and smiled tentatively when she saw me. I nodded and sat down, unsure of how to start. "I appreciate you meeting me," she said softly. "I didn't do it for you," I replied, probably a little harsher than I meant to. "The kids need clarity, and we owe it to them to figure this out." She nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand." For a moment, we just sat there in awkward silence. Then she took a deep breath and said, "I've been thinking a lot about what I've done. About how much I've hurt you, the kids, everyone. And I know I can't undo it, but I want to make amends." "Amends," I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "How do you plan to do that?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. But I've been going to therapy, and I'm learning a lot about myself, about why I made the choices I did. It doesn't excuse anything, but I want you to know I'm trying to be better. For me. For them. For us. I shook my head. You keep saying us, Connie, but I don't even know if that's possible anymore. What you did, it broke something in me. And I don't know if it can be fixed. She blinked back tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she said, I understand. And if you decide you can't forgive me, I'll accept that. But I hope you'll let me prove that I can be someone you and the kids can trust again, even if it's just as a co-parent. Her words were sincere, and for the first time, I felt like she wasn't just trying to save face. She was acknowledging the damage she'd done and the uphill battle she faced to repair even a fraction of it. We talked for over an hour, hashing out how we'd handle things moving forward. We agreed to be more transparent with the kids about where we stood, even if the answer was that we didn't have all the answers yet. We also decided to keep going to therapy, individually and together, to see if we could build a healthier way of communicating. As I left the cafe, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no neat resolution, no moment of clarity where everything suddenly made sense. But there was progress. Small, tentative steps towards something better, even if I didn't know what better would look like yet. That night, I sat down with Megan and Ryan to share what Connie and I had discussed. Megan seemed relieved, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Ryan, on the other hand, was less enthusiastic. So what? He asked. You're just going to keep pretending this family isn't broken? No, I said firmly. We're not pretending anything. But we're trying to figure out how to move forward, even if it's messy. He crossed his arms, clearly unimpressed. I don't see the point. You don't have to, I said. But you're part of this family, and we're going to do what we can to make it work, for all of us. He didn't respond, but I could tell he was listening. The next day, I went back to my writing. The story I'd been working on was taking shape in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about resilience, about finding strength in the face of unimaginable pain. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was building something new. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but maybe it didn't have to be. I'll stop here for now. Thanks for sticking with me, and as always, if you have advice or insights, I'm all ears. The road ahead still feels uncertain, but I'm starting to think that's okay. One step at a time, right? The weeks after my coffee meeting with Connie were a mixed bag. Therapy sessions continued, Ryan moved into his new apartment, and Megan seemed to find a small sense of calm. But just as I started to believe we'd found a fragile kind of balance, life threw another curveball my way. It was a Saturday afternoon when Megan asked if we could talk. I'd invited her over to my dad's house for lunch, thinking we'd chat about her classes or her plans for the summer. Instead, as we sat on the porch with sandwiches, she dropped a bombshell. Dad, she began, hesitating. There's something I think you should know. About Mom. My heart sank. What is it? She fidgeted with her bracelet, a habit she'd had since she was a kid. When all this first happened, I tried to stay neutral. I didn't want to pick sides. But I overheard some things when it was all going on. Things Mom doesn't know I know. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. What did you hear, Megan? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated again, then took a deep breath. It wasn't just Alan. There were others before him. I don't know how many, but I heard her talking to Aunt Jenna about it. She said something like, I've made mistakes before, but nothing like this. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My stomach churned as her words sank in. It wasn't just Alan. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, it was a pattern. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how, she admitted. And I wasn't even sure if it was my place. But I thought you deserved to know the truth. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. For weeks, I'd been grappling with the idea of forgiving Connie, trying to find a way to move forward. But now, everything I thought I knew was crumbling all over again. Does Ryan know? I asked. She shook her head. No. I didn't tell him. I didn't want to make things worse. I nodded, grateful for her restraint. Ryan was already angry enough. This revelation would only deepen his resentment. I'm sorry, Dad, Megan said, her eyes filling with tears. I know this makes everything harder, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. Thank you for telling me, I said. I know it wasn't easy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Megan's words in my head, trying to piece together the timeline of my marriage. How long had this been going on? How many lies had Connie told me over the years? The thought made me feel sick. The next day, I confronted Connie. We met at a park, away from the house and the kids. She seemed surprised when I asked to meet, but she showed up, her face tense with apprehension. I need to know the truth, I said as soon as we sat down. The truth about what? She asked, her voice cautious. About whether Alan was the first. Because I don't think he was. Her face fell, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. No, she admitted. He wasn't. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. How many? I asked, my voice tight with barely contained anger. 2, she said quietly. Before Alan. They were brief. Stupid. I thought I could bury them and move on, but you didn't, I finished for her. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Mark. I never wanted you to find out. I never wanted to hurt you. Her words felt hollow. You didn't want me to find out because it would make you look bad. That's not the same as not wanting to hurt me. She didn't argue. She just sat there, crying silently. I don't think I can do this anymore, I said finally. The therapy, the talks, the hope, it feels pointless now. I don't even know who you are. I understand, she said, her voice barely audible. I walked away without looking back. That night, I wrote for hours. The story I'd been crafting took a darker turn, mirroring my own emotions. Writing had become my lifeline, a way to process the pain and confusion that seemed endless. For now, I'm focusing on myself and my kids. Connie's lies have shattered any hope I had of rebuilding our marriage, but I'm determined not to let her actions define the rest of my life. Thanks for reading, everyone. If you've got advice on how to navigate this next chapter, I'd love to hear it. Right now, I'm just trying to figure out how to move forward in a way that feels true to me. One step at a time.